Welcome back. To continue our discussion on colon cancer, joining me again, Dr. Dwight Hardy with the Mingo Medical Valley, no, Mingo Medical Mingo Valley Medical Group. I'm so excited about colon cancer, I can hardly get it out. And you're associated with Southcrest Hospital.
Correct.
Let's jump right in because time's never my friend, doctor. We were talking about colon cancer and some of the colon health kind of things. Before we get into what exactly causes colon cancer, tell me a little bit more about colon cleansing, because sometimes we will self-cleanse, like so many times a month. We'll take a heavy-duty laxative so that we really are cleaning our system out.
Right.
Or we may go to someone who does do colon cleansing.
Right.
Good, bad, doesn't matter?
There's not really a lot of data that would really support colon cleansing. People oftentimes go, they have this service performed with the intent of removing toxins from the body. The reality of the world is that there's not really good scientific data that would show that there's really any nutrients or materials of substance that are being removed that are dangerous. And so people do spend a lot of time, they spend a lot of effort getting this service performed, and while there's a lot of people who believe in it, and you kind of like to walk lightly on eggshells and not, try to offend them or anything, the reality of the world is I think they'd be hard-pressed to find good quality scientific data that would support that they're actually doing something of benefit.
Okay. Could it possibly be harmful, especially if we're doing it ourselves, where we are using laxatives really repetitively during the month? Could that really cause a problem?
People who overdo laxatives have a problem that's called Hirschsprung syndrome. And that type of problem evolves from the fact that the tone of the colon becomes very laxed. Because your bowel movements are always so soft and so easily moved, the colon really doesn't have to work. The musculature, the peristalsis that moves the fecal material through the colon, really, those muscles don't have to work very much. They get weak, they get floppy, and it leads to problems down the road with being able to evacuate your bowels without having some type of a substance to help make that happen.
Okay, very good advice to be cautious of that, if at all.
Don't overdo it.
Yeah, and unless your doctor tells you to, sometimes you don't need to do it at all. Let's talk about then the colon cancer specifically. What causes colon cancer?
The preponderance of colon cancer evolves out of the result of, as we talked about before, the exposure to different types of carcinogens, different types of chemicals. We've talked about the fats in the diet. We've talked about how carbohydrates can sometimes help potentiate that. We also know that certain types of cured meats, for example, the Japanese eat a lot of different types of smoked and cured meats, that they have a little bit more of a propensity to develop these types of problems. And what happens is that we develop basically little polyps. Little growths most of the time, about 80 to 90% of the time. Colon cancer evolves out of the development of small growths or polyps that originally are benign. These are non-cancerous growths that line or develop inside the lining of the colon. And these growths over a very long period of time, as much as 5 to 7 years, 10 years even, go through a transition, a staging evolution, if you will, and go from a non-cancerous type of process to a malignancy or a cancer that can be life-threatening.
Okay, let me ask one question in terms of also the causes to clarify for people, and then I want to get into what the stagings are, and we're also going to end up talking about prevention. Genetics, you talked about, of course, the carcinogens and the foods and the things we expose ourselves to, but what about a person who says, I eat healthy. I've done all of the things that I hear I'm supposed to do, but yet I still ended up with colon cancer. I do remember that my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother had colon cancer, and someone said an uncle over here had that. Is that why I may have developed it?
Well, the answer is yes. A moment ago you had asked how does it develop, and I chatted briefly about the polyps. I also mentioned that not all colon cancer comes from that. There is non-polypoid types of colon cancer, cancer that develops not as a result of polyps, but is a genetic induced type of process. And typically it's not a great-great-great-great-grandmother, It's a father, a mother, a first-line relative, a brother or sister who developed this at an early age. And genes or genetics, which is unfortunately something you can do very little about, can be a huge factor as to whether or not you're at an increased or higher risk for this non-polyp type of cancer. People who develop these types of cancers, these genetically induced cancers, are screened much more closely, that you start a screening process much earlier in life. They're watched much more frequently. Their risk is high.
So with this, because sometimes our memory is pretty faulty, that's why I want to do the great greats, because we can think way back but forget to look right now.
Right.
So if we know that in our immediate family we have had these types of cancer, colon cancers, should we go to our doctor and say, do a certain screening test on us?
Absolutely. We haven't really touched on it yet, but colon cancer in the United States, there's roughly 150,000 cases per year that happen.
Okay.
Okay? And of those, almost a third are fatal. Okay, so when people get colon cancer, 1 out of 3 end up succumbing to the disease.
Okay.
It is the second leading cause of cancer death in the United States, only to lung cancer.
Wow.
And unlike lung cancer, colon cancer can be detected and prevented so very, very easily if we will just take the time to look, find these things early on, take care of them, of which there are several different treatments that we can talk about, and basically save your life.
Now, with these sort of screening tools, people have heard about colonoscopy. Is that, tell us what a colonoscopy is, and is that the only screening tool, especially if you have the genetic version?
Okay. When we're talking about colon, and of course there are different techniques that are used to screen different parts of the intestines.
Okay.
When we're talking about the colon, we do use a colonoscope, which is a highly flexible, some people kind of shudder when they see how long it is. it's a long scope that's very flexible, and it's used as it's placed through the rectum, going up through the large intestine, all the way around to the cecum, right where the small intestine connects to the large intestine.
Okay.
And the large intestine, you can kind of think of it as being sort of U-shaped. And the end of it, where it connects to the small intestine, is in your lower right-hand quadrant of your abdomen.
Okay.
So this thing comes all the way around, and we're able to actually visualize and look at the entire colon. And with this scope, it's done most oftentimes under a form of an anesthetic. You're given a little bit of don't care medicine. You're not technically really asleep. You're kind of in a twilight phase, and you won't remember it. It's not painful. And quite honestly, there's about 25% of people anymore that'll have this scoping done without any anesthetic at all.
Now, when do you tend to start getting colonoscopies? And then I know I have to run to a quick break. When should you start getting the colonoscopies?
Excellent question. In somebody who has very few, if any, risk factors at all, we generally think somewhere in the late 40s, certainly by 50, you ought to be having had your first colonoscopy. Prior to that, of course, we'll do some other types of screening. We'd not really mentioned yet the use of fecal occult blood testing. And that's where we just take a small smudge of bowel movement, and with that we can detect very microscopic amounts of blood actually in the stool. So if a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old is coming in for their annual examination, we'll typically do one of these types of tests, a fecal occult blood test, just to kind of screen, because people who have these polyps, people who are developing cancers, most oftentimes will have very microscopic, not detectable by the eye, but stuff that we can detect in the office, microscopic amounts of blood.
Okay, we're going to take a really quick break and come back and pick up on that.
Okay.
Please stay with us. We'll be right back.